welcome. It is absolutely fantastic to have you joining us today for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this one.
Same here. Today, our mission is to explore a pretty fascinating stack of sources. We've got historical texts, some incredibly tense legal transcripts, and retrospective analyses.
All centered around one very specific, very important book.
Exactly. And not just any book. This is a text that, honestly, fundamentally rewired human imagination. We are looking at the 1978 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition Player's Handbook.
Which, by the way, the sources note is often styled on the cover without an apostrophe in the word players. Just a little piece of trivia right out of the gate.
Good catch, and I want to point out right at the top for you listening, even if you have never once in your life rolled a 20-sided die, the modern video games you play, the fantasy tropes you love, and the very concept of leveling up, they all owe their structural DNA to this single 128-page, $9.95 hardcover book.
It is really hard to overstate just how foundational this text is. To really understand the impact, we have to set the stage a bit.
Please do.
If you look at the historical accounts of the hobby before June 1978, role-playing games were, frankly, a scattered mess.
A little Wild West.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you were playing Dungeons & Dragons back then, you were trying to make sense of a loosely organized collection of tiny digest-sized booklets, supplemental pamphlets, and random magazine articles.
I can't even imagine trying to learn a game that way today.
Right. It was heavily improvised and wildly inconsistent depending on whose basement you were in. So Gary Gygax and the publisher, TSR Inc., they created this hardcover book specifically to formalize, standardize, and elevate the entire hobby.
And it worked. I mean, the sales numbers were staggering.
Beyond staggering. Between 1979 and its discontinuation in 1990, it sold over 1.5 million copies.
Which is just wild for a tabletop game at that time.
Completely unprecedented. In 1981 alone, it hit its peak, selling 318,230 copies. That single year permanently shifted Dungeons & Dragons from a niche wargaming offshoot into a massive mainstream cultural phenomenon.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because behind that massive commercial success, the sources reveal a profoundly dramatic and bitter origin story.
Oh, yeah. The legal drama was intense.
This handbook wasn't just a creative milestone for the industry. It was actually the epicenter of a massive, industry-defining legal battle between the game's two original co-creators. We're talking about Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson.
Two legends of the space.
Right. But as I was reading through these legal transcripts, it seemed less like a simple contract dispute and more like a massive philosophical argument over who actually invented the game.
That's exactly how it played out in court. It was a clash of fundamental philosophies regarding what it actually means to create a game. In the analyses we looked at, this is often framed as the divide between the sweat of the brow and the spark of life.
I love that phrasing. So Gary Gygax argued for the sweat of the brow.
He did.
Meaning the actual physical labor of writing the book.
Precisely. He believed that his immense, grueling labor writing, the incredibly dense 128-page manual, massively expanding the mechanics and building TSR into a functioning corporation, was the paramount contribution.
And Dave Arneson, on the other hand, argued for the spark of life.
Yes. He maintained that the fundamental revolutionary conceptual leap was his unique invention.
And that leap was moving from controlling massive armies to controlling a single character, right?
Right. Traditional wargames were all about commanding battalions on a large field. Arneson introduced the idea of controlling a single individual avatar in a persistent, ongoing world. Without that conceptual spark, he argued, Gygax's mechanical labor would have absolutely no foundation.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Gygax wrote the entire 128-page book. Doesn't he have a valid point that an idea is just an idea until someone actually sits down and writes the mechanics?
He certainly felt he did, and that's exactly what triggered the lawsuit right as the Player's Handbook was launching. Back in 1975, there was a contract that entitled Arneson to a 10% royalty on D&D products.
10% is huge.
It is. But when the new advanced D&D line launched, TSR aggressively stopped paying him that royalty. They claimed this new book was a brand new, legally distinct intellectual property.
Wow. So Arneson sued them in 1979.
He did.
And the historical transcripts from that lawsuit are genuinely wild to read. You have TSR executives like Brian Bloom arguing that Arneson's original status as a foundational shareholder in TSR was enough compensation.
Even though TSR had purchased the original partnership for a mere $14,800.
Yes. Bloom contended that this early buyout was Arneson's fair share, calling the old 10% royalty agreement archaic. Gygax himself even gave a deposition claiming that AD&D was not largely copied or wholly derived from the original game.
Which is a bold claim.
Very. How did Arneson's team even begin to prove otherwise in court?
They brought in an expert witness named John Freeman, who was a highly accomplished writer for Games magazine. And Freeman performed this incredibly painstaking comparative analysis.
What did he do?
He essentially mapped the conceptual architecture and the specific mechanics from Gygax's much earlier medieval wargame, Chainmail, directly to the original D&D and then directly to the new advanced D&D.
Racing the DNA.
Exactly. He traced the genetic code of the game, successfully proving to the court that the core gameplay loops and terminology were undeniably a derivative work.
That must have been a massive blow to TSR's defense.
It really was. In the end, they reached an out-of-court settlement in March 1981. Arneson walked away with a 2.5% royalty, which secured him a highly comfortable six-figure income for the next decade.
And TSR got what they wanted too, I assume.
Yeah, TSR got to keep full creative control over the game. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this lawsuit was incredibly consequential. It established early foundational legal precedents for the tabletop industry regarding what constitutes an underlying game mechanism versus a publishable text. It proved that you cannot simply rewrite the math of a game, put a new cover on it, and claim it owes nothing to its conceptual predecessor.
Speaking of putting a new cover on it, TSR's creative control led to one of the most iconic aesthetic legacies in fantasy history.
The original cover art.
Yes, the physical book itself has this original cover art that totally defined the look of gritty, dangerous fantasy for an entire generation. It was painted by an artist named David A. Trampier.
It's such a striking piece.
And what I love about it is that it doesn't depict clean, handsome heroes standing nobly on a hill in the sunlight.
Not at all.
It shows a weary, grimy party of adventurers right after a brutal, exhausting fight. They're actively prying massive, glowing ruby eyes out of this grinning, demonic idol while standing over the bloody corpses of dead lizard monsters. They're literally just cataloging their loot.
It's a brilliant encapsulation of what first edition dungeon delving was actually like. It was fueled by greed and extreme danger. Gary Gygax noted that the imposing idol was inspired by the ancient Canaanite deity Baal.
But the artist had a different name for it, right?
Yeah, what's really interesting in the retrospective analyses is that Trampier himself affectionately referred to the demonic statue as Molly, which was a subtle, incredibly dark reference to the child-sacrificing deity Moloch.
Wow, that is incredibly dark. But honestly, it fit the vibe of the game perfectly. And then in 1983, TSR made a highly controversial decision to replace Trampier's cover with a new painting by Jeff Easley.
The one with the orange spine.
Exactly. Easley's version featured a much cleaner, more dynamic image of a lone wizard casting a spell. It's a great piece of art, but for many of the original fans, Trampier's grimy, lived-in original remains the true face of the game.
And the enduring legacy of that original Trampier cover is unfortunately tied to a genuinely heartbreaking personal story.
The Trampier tragedy.
Right. David Trampier was an absolute titan of early RPG art. He didn't just do the player's handbook. He painted the monster manual cover, and he was the creator of the incredibly beloved wormy comic strip in Dragon magazine.
He was everywhere.
But in the late 1980s, right at the absolute peak of his career, he abruptly severed all ties with TSR. The sources suspect it was due to creative and financial disputes, but whatever the exact reason, he completely vanished.
When you say vanished, you mean from the industry?
From everything. He became a total recluse. For years, rumors circulated in the gaming community that he had died. But the truth, which came out much later, was that he was living in Carbondale, Illinois, making a quiet living as a cab driver.
That is just stunning to me.
He steadfastly refused all contact with his past fame, his fans, or the publishers.
He just completely walked away from his legacy.
Tragically, yes. And in 2013, his cab company went out of business, leaving him unemployed right around the time he suffered a stroke and received a terminal cancer diagnosis. He passed away in March 2014 at the age of 59.
That is so sad.
It really is. It wasn't until 2024, a full decade after his death, that he was posthumously inducted into the Tabletop Gaming Hall of Fame.
I really want you, the listener, to just imagine that for a second. Imagine designing the core visual language of a global cultural phenomenon, having your art burned into the minds of millions of people around the world, and then choosing to walk away from all of it, just to drive a cab in silence for the rest of your life.
It is a profound tragedy, and it adds such a heavy layer of history to that original book cover.
It really does. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you finally open that iconic cover with all its history and look at the actual text inside, you hit this massive, almost unbelievable paradox.
This is my favorite part of the story.
I was reading through the retrospective analyses, and it turns out the player's handbook deliberately did not include the rules on how to actually play the game. How was that even possible?
It sounds absurd today, but it was a very intentional choice. It represents a profound epistemological divide in how Gygax viewed the game.
An epistemological divide. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, Gygax wanted to create an unbreachable wall of knowledge between the players sitting at the table and the dungeon master running the game. He wanted to preserve a vital sense of mystery, danger, and DM authority.
So keep the players in the dark.
Exactly. So he intentionally omitted the mathematical resolution of combat and what are called the saving throw tables from the player's book.
And just for clarity, a saving throw is basically your character's chance to physically dodge a trap or resist a poison, right?
Right. It's the core math of survival. Gygax didn't want players calculating the physics of his world or rules lawyering the referee. The book was designed as a massive catalog for players to define who they were, their class, their equipment, their spells, but it certainly denied them the mathematical formulas that dictated how they actually interacted with the world.
Okay, I understand the philosophy, but practically speaking, that created one of the most glaring product rollout errors in the history of the hobby.
It was a disaster.
The Player's Handbook dropped in June 1978. But the Dungeon Master's Guide, the separate book that actually contained all those missing combat rules, didn't release until August 1979.
A full 14 months later.
So for over a year, players had this beautiful $10 hardcover game manual that was literally unplayable as written.
The community was absolutely forced to scramble. Eager players had to reverse engineer the combat math from the older 1974 digest booklets, or rely on incomplete preview tables printed in Dragon magazine, or honestly just invent their own resolution mechanics to bridge that massive gap.
They were just making it up as they went.
They had to. This raises an important question about modern user experience. Imagine buying a premium hardcover video game manual today, but the developer intentionally leaves out the instructions for the jump and attack buttons for over a year just to maintain a sense of mystery.
The modern internet would absolutely riot. It's wild to think about. But while the core math was missing, what was in the book was a sheer, unprecedented density of mechanics for character creation.
Oh, the detail was staggering.
This handbook took the hobby from simple improvisation into granular, intense simulation. Let's look at the character options. It exploded the original roster from just 3 classes up to 11. You had your classic fighters, illusionists, and druids.
The staples of fantasy.
But it also normalized morally ambiguous classes, like the assassin, which the sources note came with highly specific instant kill matrices, basically complex tables just for assassinations.
Yeah.
And thieves. But I have to ask you about the bard. I saw a note here that the bard was a prestige class. What does that mean?
Oh, the Bard in first edition is infamous. It wasn't a standard class you could just pick at level 1. It was this bizarre, heavily convoluted prestige class hidden away in an appendix.
Hidden in an appendix. Yeah.
To become a bard, a player first had to level up as a fighter, then completely switch their class to a thief and level up again, and then finally study under druids just to learn how to cast magic.
That is hilarious.
It was an absolutely insane years-long pipeline just to play a character who plays the lute.
That is so much work for a lute. And speaking of magic, the magic system itself was equally granular. The sources refer to it as Vancian magic, named after the sci-fi and fantasy author Jack Vance.
Yes, Vancian magic is a huge part of the game's identity.
Spellcasters in this game didn't have a video game-style pool of mana. They had to spend hours studying to memorize specific spells, and the exact moment they cast one, the magical energy violently discharged, and the knowledge was instantly wiped from their memory.
Gone entirely.
They completely forgot how to do it until they studied again.
And this edition introduced highly specific material components for those spells. It wasn't just waving a magic wand. This added a deep layer of logistical resource management to the game.
Which is putting it mildly. I was laughing so hard at the component list.
They get pretty strange.
If you wanted to cast a basic spell to climb a wall, you needed to physically have a live spider in your pocket.
Just hanging out in your robes.
Right. If you wanted to cast a sleep spell, you needed a pinch of fine sand. To resurrect the dead, you needed a flawless diamond worth thousands of gold pieces. The sheer logistics of a wizard walking around with pockets full of live spiders and sand is amazing.
It really is. And we should also mention psionics. These were science fiction mental powers, like telepathy.
In a medieval fantasy game.
Exactly. What's funny is that Gygax actually didn't want them in his medieval fantasy game at all, but he was forced to include them in the book due to intense pressure from a very vocal base of players in Chicago.
Chicago players demanding telepathy.
Mm.
I love it. Now,
Yes. The trade-off was that non-humans had rigid, immutable level caps. They could only get so powerful.
while humans could keep going.
Exactly. Humans got absolutely no special abilities at level 1, but they could level up infinitely. This was mathematically designed by Gygax so that humans would statistically dominate the high-level demographics of any fantasy world, keeping it somewhat human-centric.
And then there were the controversial gender-based strength caps. In the preface of the book, Gary Gygax proudly declared that there were no baseless limitations placed on female strength.
But the math told a different story.
Very much so. The retrospective analyses point out a glaring contradiction. Mere pages later, the character creation tables included a rigid matrix that arbitrarily capped the maximum physical strength of female characters significantly below that of male characters across all races.
It directly contradicted his own introduction.
Right. And it created a permanent historical record of the era's terrestrial biases embedded right into the fantasy math.
It was a system heavily biased toward rigid simulationist constraints. And that simulation was famously unapologetically lethal. The early game was an absolute meat grinder.
Oh yeah, the sources talk about how fragile you were at the start.
A first-level magic user was mathematically so fragile they could easily be killed by a single bite from a common house cat.
Defeated by a tabby cat before you even reached the dungeon.
It happened. Because survival was so rare, the game required an exhaustive economy of survival. The player's handbook was filled with incredibly detailed economic tables, so players could hire what the sources affectionately call NPC meat shields.
And for anyone who doesn't know, an NPC is a non-player character. The DM runs them. Basically, you'd hire a peasant to walk down the dark hallway first to see if there were any traps.
Exactly, and the handbook priced this out meticulously. An unskilled hireling like that peasant willing to carry a torch into a dungeon cost 2 silver pieces a day.
A bargain for your life.
True. But a skilled mercenary who actually knew how to hold a sword cost 2 gold pieces. The DM relied heavily on these player tables to manage the massive payrolls and logistics of these adventuring companies.
Which brings us to another amazing aspect to the book. While players were calculating their silver pieces and managing their live spider inventory, they were also inadvertently absorbing the lore of Gary Gygax's private home campaign right out of his basement in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin.
What's fascinating here is how the player's handbook functioned as accidental world building.
Accidental world building.
Yeah, without explicitly writing a lore book, Gygax codified the Great Wheel cosmology, permanently mapping out the multiverse for millions of players.
Just through the mechanics.
Right. It established the prime material plane where standard adventuring happens, the elemental inner planes of fire and water, the transitive misty, ethereal, and silvery astral planes, and the 16 alignment-based outer planes, like the 9 hells or the absolute chaos of limbo.
That's incredibly expansive.
By just listing where certain spells or monsters drew their power from, it forced players to rethink the entire narrative boundaries of their games.
And it wasn't just the geography of the universe. It was the history, cleverly hidden right in the magic system. The book is full of what's called eponymous magic spells named after legendary wizards.
Some of the most famous spells in the game.
I was reading the spell list, and you have Bigby's Crushing Hand, Melf's Acid Arrow, Tensor's Floating Disc. For years, I assumed these were ancient fictional legends Gygax invented for deep lore, but the sources reveal they were just real people from Gygax's home game.
They absolutely were. Tensor is just an anagram for his son, Ernest. Melf was his other son, Luke's character, literally standing for male elf.
That's amazing.
Dramus is just the name of a player, Jim Ward, spelled backwards. And Tasha, who has a very famous spell called Tasha's Uncontrollable Hideous Laughter, was actually named after a young fan who sent Gygax enthusiastic letters written in crayon.
That is incredibly wholesome.
Yeah.
But the notes highlight a specific anecdote about the wizard Bigby that I think perfectly captures the spirit of the game.
Yes, the Bigby lore is my favorite example of this. Bigby has over a dozen hand-themed spells in the book. But originally, in the home game, Bigby was an evil, third-level NPC dungeon dweller created by another player, Rob Kuntz, who was co-DMing.
So he was an enemy.
Exactly. Gary Gygax, who was playing as his own legendary wizard character, Mordenkainen, managed to get the drop on this evil NPC. He cast a charm spell on him, and through persistent in-game roleplay, forced him into a neutral alignment and made him his apprentice.
Just through playing the game.
Yes, that specific, spontaneous moment between friends playing a game in a basement was hard-coded into the printed spell list, cementing it into global mythology forever.
So what does this all mean? It means the rules in this massive hardcover weren't just math. They were quite literally an oral history of a group of friends in Wisconsin having fun.
Exactly. It captured lightning in a bottle.
As we wrap up, we have to acknowledge the dual legacy of the 1978 Player's Handbook. Today, modern game designers heavily criticize it for its disjointed mechanics.
It is definitely clunky by modern standards.
You have to roll high on a 20-sided die to hit with a sword, but roll low on percentile dice to use a thief skill, and then roll a 1 on a 6-sided die just to find a secret door.
Not intuitive at all.
It's written in this tiny font in a wacky stream of consciousness style that buries critical rules in massive walls of text. Yet, at the exact same time, it remains fiercely beloved, especially by the old-school Renaissance or OSR community, for its uncompromising, gritty, bomb-proof vision of what fantasy can be.
At its core, the first edition Player's Handbook was far more than a set of clunky rules. It provided millions of people with the structural blueprints required to construct entirely new identities, and despite its missing combat math, it gave them a framework to navigate the boundless architecture of human imagination.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to explore on your own. Building on that idea of the epistemological divide, the fact that Gygax intentionally left the combat rules out of the player's manual to preserve mystery.
It's a bold design choice.
What if the most powerful tool in game design, or really in any collaborative creative endeavor, isn't the exhaustive list of rules you meticulously write down, but rather the critical information you intentionally choose to leave out, forcing your audience to step up and fill in the blanks with their own imagination?
That is a great question to ponder.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay insanely curious, and we will catch you next time.